Hey everyone, and thank you for coming by tonight. We've got a awesome discussion slash debate coming up. We did have some last minute technical difficulties. We couldn't get Gavin on without him dropping out for some reason. I'm not 100% on what's going on his side, but Jonathan, as well as Nathaniel and Brenton, thought, you know what, this might even give us more room for discussion. So please let us know out there if there's any problems with the audio or anything, because obviously James the Great's not here and it's me filling in. So please let us know on that. But also, I just want to let everybody know or remind everybody that this is a place that anybody can come, no matter their background, no matter your walk of life. We want to make sure that everybody feels welcome here and that everybody is included. With that being said, please hit the like and subscribe button if you like these types of conversations. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the format of 5-minute openings for each contender. And then we're going to jump into an open discussion. And then we'll go into Q&A. So if you have any questions, please tag me at Converse Contender. Thank you so much, Tiago, for that. And I'll just kick it over to Jonathan to start us off.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to a spirited, engaging discussion. So, I'm going to go through the argument that I presented in a debate at the weekend, also on this channel. I don't think that the argument was engaged with, so I'm interested to present it again this evening to see whether my partners in discussion can do a better job of refuting it. But I presented the argument from what I call messianic convergence, which is where we see various instances in the gospel biographies of Jesus' life where there's a striking correlation with the Old Testament in a way that is unlikely to be the product of mere coincidence, but points rather to design. And since we have good, strong historical support for the incidents in question, it points to the hypothesis of divine design rather than human design. The strength of evidence for a proposition is best measured in terms of the ratio of two probabilities, namely the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis and the probability of the evidence given the falsehood of that hypothesis, or the negation of that hypothesis. So the ratio may be top-heavy, in which case the evidence favors your hypothesis. It might be bottom-heavy, or neither, in which case evidence favors neither hypothesis, and we would not call it evidence for or against your hypothesis. Bayes' theorem is a mathematical tool for modeling our evaluation of evidences to appropriately apportion the confidence in our conclusions to the strength of the evidence. Dividing the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis by the probability of the evidence given the annulment of that hypothesis gives you what's referred to in probability theory as the Bayes factor. And the Bayes factor is a measure of the strength of evidence and indicates how many times more likely it is that you will observe this evidence given that your hypothesis is true than if it were false. For instance, a Bayes factor of 100 indicates that your evidence is 100 times more likely if your hypothesis is true than if it were false. And this form of reasoning is used routinely in discipline of forensic science. For instance, the presence of the defendant's fingerprints on a murder weapon may be taken as evidence for the hypothesis of guilt over the hypothesis of non-guilt, because the probability of the defendant's fingerprints being on the murder weapon is much higher on the hypothesis that the defendant is guilty than on the hypothesis that he is not guilty. And so I seek to present a positive confirmatory argument for the veracity of the Christian gospel by looking at various striking correlations between the events in Jesus' life and the Old Testament scriptures. And the argument can be summarized in syllogistic form as follows. Premise 1, the correlation between events recorded in the Gospels and Hebrew Scripture is either the product of human design or divine design. Premise 2, it is not the product of human design. Conclusion, therefore, it is a product of divine design. So just to summarize a few examples, we can discuss in more detail as time permits. The fact that Jesus' death coincides with the Jewish feast of Passover, given the theological import of that fact, I think, is more probable on the hypothesis of divine orchestration of history than it is on the annulment of that hypothesis. Second one is the selection of the Passover lamb, which, so according to John chapter 12, Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. And according to the book of Exodus in chapter 12, the Jews were to select their Passover lamb and bring it into their homes 5 days before Passover. And so you've got another coincidence there. Another one is Jesus being the first fruits. In 1 Corinthians 15:20, Paul says of Christ, he's the first fruits of those who've fallen asleep. And Jesus, of course, was raised allegedly on the day following the Sabbath, following Passover, on which day fell the Feast of First Fruits. And even if you don't accept the resurrection as an historical event, nonetheless, the evidence, I think, is quite compelling that the original Christian proclamation was that Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared on the third day following his death on the Sunday, the Feast of First Fruits. And given the theological import of Christ being the first fruits from among the dead, the first race to glory and immortality, that again is a striking coincidence. Even the name Jesus itself is significant. The name itself means Yahweh is salvation, and ties in also with Zechariah 6, where you have an individual who's a foreshadow of the Messiah, given the name of Yeshua, and specifically said to be a foreshadow of the coming Messiah. A final example is the fact that Christianity becomes the international global religion that it becomes, because in various passages throughout the Old Testament, Isaiah 49:6, for example, and Isaiah 42, and passages in Zechariah and so forth, and Daniel indicate that the part of the Messiah's job description was to bring a knowledge of the God of Israel to representatives of all nations of the world. That is highly improbable on the hypothesis that Jesus is not the Messiah, especially given the persecution of Christians up until 313 AD, where we had the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. But the probability on the hypothesis Jesus is the promised Messiah, the probability of that happening is approximately equal to 1, based upon those predictions in the Old Testament. And so it's a cumulative argument, not when you have multiple lines of evidence that cumulatively point to that conclusion. So I'll finish with that. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for that. We'll kick it over to Nathan, get us started on their side.
Sorry, I was, pardon me, I was a little parched. All right, so first off, thank you so much again for having me on here. I really feel like I'm a detriment to the channel, so this one's on you. And Jonathan, it's good to see you again, and Brent, it's good to meet you. Is Christianity true is one of the most important questions I believe we can currently ask. It's currently the world's largest religion, with 2.3 billion followers, comprising just over 1/3 of the world's population. It has led to the creation and demise of enormous and powerful empires, led to the creation of Islam and many Christian cults, and shapes much of our world's politics. I would contend there is no person more important historically than Jesus, and no belief more important than that of Christianity. But is it true? And how would we know? New Testament scholar Kearsarge Lake provided a path when, at the turn of the 20th century, he said, "The first task of the historical inquirer is to collect the pieces of evidence. The second is to discuss the trustworthiness and meaning of each separate piece. And the third is to reconstruct the events to which the evidence relates." Now, using this method, as well as the 4-point approach utilized by Bart Ehrman and many other current historians, in addition to searching for independent attestation, dissimilarity, and contextual credibility, one should have an open mind and honestly accept where the evidence leads. Well, does the evidence lead us to Christianity? Is it true? I contend the answer is a resounding no, and I will lay out my argument quickly and conclude with 2 points. 1, Jesus most certainly existed, and he was an apocalyptic Jewish rabbi in the 1st century Palestine. 2, his followers thought he was the Messiah, but Messiah didn't mean then what Christians take it as now. It simply meant anointed one. The Gospels may have considered Jesus the Son of God, but that was not unique. Both David and Solomon, along with the nation of Israel, were all called the Son of God. The only canonical writings we have about the life of Jesus are the 4 Gospels. Irreconcilably contradictory anonymous texts written 40 to 65 years after the death of Jesus from authors who were not eyewitnesses and did not receive their information from any of those who claimed to be eyewitnesses. There are 0 texts written concurrent to the life of Jesus or the disciples, which is certainly odd considering the feats they were supposed to have accomplished. We have no original documents, only copies of copies of copies, which have been translated over and over again. The Gospels were written in Greek by Christians likely not living in Palestine, evidenced by the fact that the author of the book of Mark gets basic Palestinian geography wrong. Joseph of Arimathea, a central point in at least the end of the Passion narrative, likely never even existed. Believing one sees something and actually having seen it are not the same thing. I believe I can show that Jesus never claimed to be God and his disciples never believed it. And we have no evidence any of the disciples were martyred for their faith, and really no evidence at all for most of them after they ran away because their Messiah, the only one they thought would be the king of Israel and rule over the 12 tribes, of which they thought they would be lesser kings, was taken and changed by Jewish priests, something else which would have not happened. The trial by Pilate would not have ever happened the way that the Gospels portray it, and I contend that every single historian states that to be the case. And I could go on and on and on, but I will close with two conclusions. First, there is simply no evidence Jesus was even laid in a tomb, but moreover that he rose from the dead. And Paul said, without the resurrection, Christianity is dead. The disciples and women even give this away because they believed his body was stolen. And my final conclusion, today, the person who was best suited to be the next president of the United States suspended her campaign. And Elizabeth Warren, I'm still with you. Persist. Thank you.
Ooh. All right. Thanks so much, Nathaniel, for that. All right, Brenton, your last up, man. Give us your opening, and then we'll go into the open discussion.
Sure, though I think I should add off that I'm a Bernie bro. So, but
hey, if he makes it, I'll vote for him.
As long as she bends the knee, I'm going to be happy. All right. So anyway, I'm going to jump into my thing, but just for those of you who don't know my background, I am a writer, playwright in New York, had 7 productions produced. I'm working on a novel. I have a comic book out, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse. There's a successfully funded Kickstarter. We're about to break $7,500 to fund the next issue of this, drawn by Luana Vecchio. So if you can, check it out, push us over that line. Link should be in the description. But let's get on into this because I am also a Buddhist with Soka Gakkai International. Have been since 2014, and I am a former men's leader from Harlem after I aged out of the YMD district. So the question of this debate is Christianity true? And that, to me, speaking as a Buddhist, is potentially a very interesting question, but not in the way that some of you might expect. Usually these types of arguments tend to either be an examination of the historicity of the Bible, or they tend to be an indictment or defense of various miraculous happenings described within. The thing about these kind of questions and these kinds of stories is that from the perspective of a Buddhist like myself, I can tell you we aren't really that impressed by miracles. If you read the various sutras, they are full of miracles and miraculous happenings. In the Lotus Sutra, for instance, the 16th chapter, known as the Lifespan chapter, the sutra describes how Shakyamuni Buddha, as he preaches his final teachings towards the end of his life, on Holy Eagle Peak, he gathers together all the Buddhas that ever were and ever would be, as well as various figures from Chinese and Hindu mythology. And before this assembled host, the Buddha raises his hands, and out of the earth there emerges a giant treasure tower made of the 7 kinds of gems. I'm talking emeralds, rubies, sapphires, all of them glinting and gleaming in the sun. And then the Buddha raises his hands higher, and both he and the tower begin to fly. Soon his audience follows, and as cherry blossoms rain down on everyone, from the water dragons to the devil king of the 6th heaven, they are all together drawn up into the air with Shakyamuni Buddha. And once they reach the altitude, the Buddha opens up the tower's only door, and within waits the Buddha who was Buddha before Shakyamuni was Buddha. And together, this pair preaches the ultimate and final teachings to that assembled multitude, the ultimate and final teachings of Shakyamuni. Now, did this sermon in the air literally happen? I don't know. Could have. I mean, Shakyamuni could have been magic. The man who was originally named Siddhartha Gautama could have, through meditation and lengthy practice, tapped into some form of psychic energy that we don't yet understand and may never understand. He could have also utilized some form of trickery like a stage magician, or even stumbled upon some ancient alien technology to accomplish this feat. But besides being a visual on par with the latest Marvel movies and an experience slightly above the latest Marvel movies, what does that actually say about the value of his teaching? I mean, it's great for getting people's attention, but more important than that is what you actually say when you have their attention and what they take away from that, from what is said. What is important is not the act itself, but what the act communicates and its effect. The lifespan chapter is considered the beating heart of Mahayana Buddhism, and that's not because the Buddha may have had this power, but instead the fact that this chapter is taken as a metaphor for everyone's own inherent Buddha nature. The critical thing about this story, the real truth of the Lotus Sutra, is the realization that we, and by we I mean every one of us, me and you and everybody here, we are the treasure tower. That is our true nature. That our true nature is in fact something so beautiful and glorious and seemingly impossible as a giant glimmering tower of gemstones emerging from the earth and taking flight. That's what's important about the Lotus Sutra. It's not a chronicle of a cool guy who did literally awesome things, but a work of great art and staggeringly insightful philosophy that points human beings to as close as it can to the true nature of reality. Not the everyday world that we see, but the real world that is obscured by Maya, by illusion. The illusions that come along with being the sort of creature that possesses individual consciousness. Ultimately, religion and religious practice is distinct from both history and science. Religion has very different goals and very different strengths and weaknesses, and it speaks to a unique part of us that is exceptionally difficult to pin down and quantify. As a Buddhist, I see religion and religious practice not as a collection of esoteric truths or a series of moral and ethical commands backed up by the threat of supernatural violence, but instead as a practical method for the cultivation and maintenance of faith, which at the very least is crucial for human psychological health and material success. And if I am to exercise that faith muscle that my practice builds, I will say that at most, faith is a necessary component to a vehicle that generates enlightenment for the good of all sentient creatures. So if you ask me, is Christianity true, then that is the lens by which I am going to answer the question. The true test of any religion is, does it inspire its adherents to live better lives? Does it successfully build faith in a healthy and harmonious way that leads its practitioners and their communities to a better and more correct understanding of the universe, their place within it, and their relationship to each other along with this planet? The other species on this planet that inhabit it, and at the end of everything, their relationship with ultimate reality. If a practice can answer that in the affirmative, that's a true religion to me, as opposed to the cultish worship of what is essentially a real-life superhero. And I look forward to this dialogue helping me to determine the answer to that question, at least in a limited capacity. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for that, Brenton. So I guess we'll jump straight into the open discussion. I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question for the Q&A, please tag me at Converse Contender, not Modern Day Debate. That way I'll be able to see it and go ahead and get it and put it in for the Q&A section. If you have any super chats, we'll push those to the top of the list. And just thanks everybody for being here. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. That lets James know that these are the type of debates that people want to see. And so if you like this type of format, go ahead and hit that like button. That way that we have some positive feedback. And since Jonathan's by himself tonight, if I hear something from the other side that I might think, that's an interesting question for them, maybe I'll throw that in as well. But I don't think Jonathan will need it. So, Jonathan, with that, you've heard the other side. Why don't we jump straight in with you?
Absolutely. So I would be interested to hear how the other side would interact with the argument I presented in my opening statement, and we can take things from there.
I'm sorry?
I think he means to interact with your opening statement. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, got you.
Do you want to take that one, Nathan? Or
I mean, I'm not going to talk about Bayes' theorem. People use Bayes' theorem to show that Jesus never even existed as well. So it just shows that it can lead to whatever you want it to lead you to.
So one thing I'd say on that is that people also use deductive arguments to establish all sorts of wrong conclusions, but that doesn't undercut the validity of deductive syllogisms.
Yeah, and it can't lead you to the Bayes' theorem can lead you also to again, as somebody in the chat put, it can lead you to showing that Jesus never even existed. It doesn't lead. And what you're going to say is that Carrier, and I don't agree with him, but what you're going to say is that people like Carrier are using it the wrong way.
Exactly.
He would say you're using it the wrong way. And guess what? Can both of you be right?
No, but it's the same with deductive arguments, that if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. The same thing applies here.
Yeah, and Carrier would say the same thing to you.
Yeah, and so we have to actually evaluate them the arguments on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think that I don't agree with Carrier's conclusion, but I don't use Bayes' theorem to try and figure out whether a person rose from the dead or not.
I didn't argue. Well, in this particular argument, I didn't argue Jesus.
What does it take for Christianity to be true? The only way, and Paul said it very specifically, right? He said it only takes one thing for Christianity to be true.
I think that the resurrection of Jesus is strong evidence for Christianity being true, but I think there are other arguments as well, in addition to the resurrection argument.
If Jesus never rose from the dead, is Christianity true?
No.
Okay. Is the resurrection of Jesus the most important piece of that?
Yeah, I'd say so. I don't agree with many apologists, though, who argue that if Jesus rose from the dead, then that proves Christianity. Because I think that what's the theological import of the resurrection? We only know that from the Gospels, what Jesus said according to the Gospels, and so I think that we need to make an argument for the robust reliability of the Gospels, as well as the case for the resurrection.
Which I would challenge you to do.
Yeah. I kind of want to quibble with I remember you said that, and now I know why I wrote down Paul. And I tend to have issues with Paul in general from what I remember from my religious studies. But I would actually contend that Christianity is not necessarily untrue if the resurrection didn't happen. What's really important to understand is so one of the concepts that we have in Nichiren Buddhism, and this comes from the 4th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, is what's called expedient or skillful means. And if you read a lot of Hindu texts, especially the Upanishads and a number of other very early the Vedas, you'll find that these stories are constantly contradicting each other. And the Upanishads tell 8 stories of the creation of the universe, 8 different mutually exclusive ones. The point is not to point at this one story here worked or this one, or they all happened at once. The point is that when we're talking about something like ultimate reality, when we're talking about the universe taken as a whole, it's something that human brains can only get so much around, even with as impressive as they are. So a lot of the times what these are pointing at is they're pointing you in the direction of the truth. So what they would say is with a skillful means, for instance, they compared it to imagine, for instance, you've got a family living in a big mansion. It's an older mansion. The children have lived in there their whole lives. They've never even gone outside. They have no idea what outside even is. Well, one day the mansion catches fire. And suddenly the dad's sitting there oh my God, the mansion's on fire. I've got my kids right here. What do I do? How do I get them out the door? They don't know what fire is. I can't explain this to them. So he goes, hey, kids, hang on. You see those toys you're playing with right here? Well, I'll tell you what, if you go out that door right over there, there are toys just like that. And there's so many more of them, and they're way better. And the kids immediately get excited. They get up, they run out, and the father follows them out, and the house burns down. And they come out and they're whoa, Dad, what the heck? What's going on? These toys aren't here. You lied. Now, yeah, he told them something that was untrue, but that does not mean that he lied. What he did was he employed skillful means that got them to do a thing that was important in a specific time and specific place. So if you're talking about, the experience of the resurrection, or you're talking about Jesus, the historical figure, there is a lot to be taken from that, whether or not there is magic involved. And similarly, you can almost see that Jesus, from the way he talks about it, It's very possible that he had what was called a satori, an enlightening experience, where he saw the universe in a way that other people tend not to in their normal consciousness. And of course, someone coming from Jesus's background who experiences a satori would express that in terms that he understands, which is the Jewish Hebrew traditions of the Near East. So I'm not necessarily sure that you can really say that it's not true, or maybe you can say it's not true if there's no resurrection, but I'm not sure that that is a relevant question, if that makes sense.
I think it's very relevant, because without resurrection, there's no Christianity.
I agree.
That's a basic tenet of Christianity.
Right.
And for several reasons. First of all, Paul says so in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, Christ has not been raised from the dead, we're still in our sins. Our faith is futile, we're of all men to be most pitied. Jesus himself says so in various passages in the Gospels. For example, in John chapter 2, when the Jews confront Jesus after he cleansed the temple and ask him, what sign do you show us to prove your authority to do this? He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up, speaking about his body and his resurrection from the dead. And so and various other passages as well in the Gospels, Jesus says that the resurrection from the dead is God's vindication of Jesus' messianic and divine credentials. In Acts 17, Paul says that God has said the day when he will judge the world in righteousness by the man he's appointed. He's given assurance of this to all people by raising him from the dead. So the resurrection is crucial for Christianity.
Yeah, but I mean, also keep in mind, the man spoke in parables constantly. And he, what you also have right there is, if he's talking about like why I have this authority, and he's saying, I'm going to, can you give me the quote exactly?
There's lots of them in the Gospels.
Right. Just give me the one you were using is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. In John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, so the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and he will raise it up in 3 days. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
Yeah, but I mean, honestly, that sounds like you could take that a number of different ways. You could take that the way of him literally saying, I will literally raise this temple, as if he's making a boast that he's not actually going to do. Or you could take it as people imposing a pattern on his speech afterwards. I mean, a great example of that is like, have you guys ever done this thing, and anybody at home? Draw any organic shape, just anything, not a circle, not just like any kind of like blobby thing. And you can turn that into a face with only a single point. Just pop a pen in, one little dot, bam, you have a face because you have an eye. The human brain goes and imposes structure on what is essentially chaos. So I'm not sure that if you're saying like Jesus said, my evidence is I will recreate this temple, and then he dies, and then he comes back, and they're like, oh, he meant that. I'm just not seeing that is necessarily, like, I don't even understand how that's supposed to demonstrate that he has that authority, especially not in that moment.
The allusion or reference to 3 days is also associated in many passages in the Gospels with Jesus' claim and prediction about the resurrection. So, for instance, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, Jesus says, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
He's not talking about himself there, and I would actually contend that that in the Gospel of John that he never actually said that either. The Gospel of John. No, I don't think.
What did you not say?
I don't think Jesus ever said destroy the temple and he'll raise it in 3 days.
I would argue that he did. So here's the evidence.
Yeah, of course you would. You're a Christian. You think the Bible is true. I don't think.
Well, let's look at the evidence. If we go to Mark 14:58.
Mm-hmm.
I should pull up the Bible gateway. Okay. If we go to Mark 14:58, this is when Jesus is at his trial before the high priest Caiaphas, and false witnesses step forward, and they say, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.
What does Jesus say?
Are you going to let me finish?
What does Jesus say?
Let me finish. Even about this, their testimony did not agree. Also in Matthew 26:61, you see the same thing. In Mark 15:29, you see he's on the cross and the passers-by are passing by mocking him, saying, aha, you're the one who said you would destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days, come down from the cross now if you're the Son of God. Now, notice that that nothing in Matthew or Mark gives us a pretext for that allegation against Jesus. And so it's kind of an unexplained illusion there. There's no backstory or pretext provided to us in the Synoptic Gospels as to what Jesus said. But it seems not something that's a fabrication out of whole cloth, but rather more like a garbled version of something Jesus was likely said, especially in view of the 3 days reference, which is often associated with Jesus' resurrection predictions. When you go over to John 2, 18 and 19, as I alluded to earlier, we see the pretext for the accusation, but not the later misrepresentations, and it's just an accusation. Notice that Jesus did not say, destroy the man-made temple that's made with human hands and build another one not made by human hands. Rather, he said he was speaking about his resurrection. So you've got an undesigned coincidence there between the Synoptics and John, that John provides the original statement, but not the later use as an accusation. The Synoptics give us the later accusation, but not the original statement. So there you have independent support.
Yeah, or he could have been talking about, I will rebuild the temple with telepathical power. I'm not sure that. So this, like, you're talking about a lot of coincidences where things line up in the text with other things in the text. And that's just how humans tell stories. I mean, that's how I work as a writer, where you will see recurring motifs in my work. And sometimes they're motifs that I intend, and sometimes they're motifs that come in. It doesn't necessarily say anything about the work other than the fact that I'm either really cool and brilliant, or also, I've spent a lot of time working in various motifs and running gags and references. So if you're seeing recurring things happen, I mean, I don't see how that's evidence for anything necessarily being literally true. But again, I will also say that I don't think necessarily it's important that it be literally true for reasons I've already gone into.
The example I just gave is an instance of what I call undesigned coincidences, which is where you have a question that's raised by, you have multiple accounts concerning an event, and an actual question is raised by one account, which is answered incidentally by another account. So in that case, you've got the question raised by Mark and Matthew, namely, well, did Jesus actually say this? What did Jesus say that gave rise to this accusation? John gives us the original statement, which then explains Matthew and Mark, thus pointing to the veracity of both.
Okay, or it points to a writer putting structure onto it, because again, the human brain, we don't grab everything. We have specific spotlight consciousness where we can't write literally everything that's happening all the time. So
yeah, that's why it points to truth. So the fictions are not like this.
I'm confused why it points to. Well, hang on. I just want to. Why does that point to truth?
Because fictions are not like this. When you have multiple authors, and one raises a natural question which is explained in passing in an undesigned way, that is evidence for the veracity of the account.
I mean, no, not necessarily, because first off, there can be a coincidence, where second of all, it can be purposefully added by a writer or an editor later on.
So you need to provide evidence for that.
Well, I mean, again, you don't need to provide evidence of absence. You would need evidence that this. So a coincidence is just the brain imposing a structure on what it sees. Again, there's a Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Are you guys familiar with this?
No.
Okay, so Bader-Meinhof phenomenon is someone will hear something very odd, very out of line, or maybe a certain sequence of numbers or something, and they're like, oh, okay. And then suddenly they'll start seeing that sequence repeat around them, like frequently for weeks or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, say someone sees, the number 15116. And they see that on their computer, and then they walk into the thing and they see that, and then they get a text message from 15116. It's not that what's happening there is that their brain, they've encountered 15116 over and over and over again, but because of selective attention, they ignore it until it becomes known to them, and then suddenly they start recognizing the pattern, because we humans are pattern-seeking creatures. Again, like I would say, large coincidences can be compelling, and they can be an idea that maybe we should look into something more, but I don't see them as in any way being direct evidence of something, if that makes sense.
Nathan, what do you think about undesigned coincidences? Does it add to the credibility of a historical narrative?
It can, but you'd have to have additional evidences built into it. Like in the book of Mark, when they ask him if he said those things, what does he say, Jonathan? What is his response?
He's not asked that at all.
When it mentions, he said you're going to build it up in 3 days, or tear it down and build it up in 3 days. What's his response to them?
Jesus does not reply.
Yeah. What does he do in Matthew?
It's the same. It's a parallel account.
Oh, now, mind you, now Matthew is copied 95% from Mark, so it's probably not a good idea to go there. That's the thing. So you have John written 20 years after Luke, and he just happens to say it. This is also the only, now mind you, it's the only gospel where Jesus actually claims to be God as well. So
no, it's not.
Yes, it is. And I've been over this. I have been over.
I've written extensively.
You can't help but interrupt, can you? Like Jesus
well,
Christ!
You're
stop interrupting me.
You're making false
Nathaniel
claims.
make his point, and then we'll go back to you.
Okay.
It's the most legendary account. It adds the most, pardon me, bullshit. It's got super Jesus in there. Jesus literally walking forward instead of Judas walking up and kissing him on the cheek or lips or whatever. I don't really care. Do what you want, bro. Instead, he walks up and he's like, "Yo, I'm Jesus," and they all fall down, because he's got like divine powers in the book of John, right? And he's like bench pressing the cross in the book of John, right? No, all these divinic type of things that are added in the book of John are simply ways to make it so that he's more actually divine. These things that happen, he doesn't even respond or ever say in any of the other gospels or the apocryphal ones outside of Peter. He never even actually says anything like this. So why should we think that he actually said it? Because it's only in one gospel, right? He doesn't respond to the charges in the other ones.
So you made a lot of false claims in that statement.
Oh, name one.
Yeah, you made quite a number. For example, you claimed that the Gospel of John is the only gospel that indicates the deity of Christ, and that's just flatly false.
It's where the only one where Jesus claimed to be God.
Oh, that's false too.
No, it's not.
I can give you multiple examples. I'll give you one.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll give you one example. And there's so many to pick from.
Oh, I know. There's so many. That's why I made the claim that I know there's four verses in the book of John where he claims to be God. Other than that, there is zero in the entire gospel.
In the Gospel of John. Wow, there's tons of the Gospel of John.
No, there's only four of them in the Gospel of John.
Which
he says, I am the Father of one. Before Abraham was, I am. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Right? I mean, there's one more. There's the only places where he ever says, I'm God.
Okay, I could point to more, but let me go to...
Why don't you? Get to it.
Okay, let's get to the Synoptic Gospels. So Matthew chapter 11, this is when John the Baptist has sent disciples to Jesus to ask him, are you the one we're expecting, or should we look for another? And Jesus answered them, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is one who's not offended by me. So, so the context here is John the Baptist sent disciples to Jesus, asking, "Are you the one we're expecting?" And so as they went away, what did Jesus say to the crowds concerning John? He says, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet." And then verse 10, pay attention. "This is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face. He will prepare your way before me." And so he says that John the Baptist is that messenger from Malachi 3, verse 1, that was sent to prepare the way for Yahweh. And
not Yahweh, for the Messiah, the apocalyptic Messiah.
Let's go and read it then. Malachi 3.
No, I'm not going to read Malachi 3. You got to stay in the You got to stay in the Gospels, bro. Jesus never comes out and says, "I'm God," except for in the book of John.
I just gave you an example.
He did not say, "I'm God, I'm divine." The only time he ever says that in the book of John.
Not in those exact words, but it's strongly implied because he.
It's strongly. If it's strongly implied, why didn't he say it? Why didn't Mark actually come out and say, or Luke or Matthew? I'm God.
I mean, I would go as far as to say he doesn't even necessarily say it in John.
Well, Brenton, let's let let's let Jonathan finish that point, because I think he was trying to link what was being said, what Christ said about himself there, with a prophecy about the Yahweh in the Old Testament. So
absolutely, my mistake, John.
That's fine.
Thank you. So Malachi chapter 3 says, Behold, I send my messenger, he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord, in Hebrew says Ha-Adon, which is the title only ever used of Yahweh. Ha-Adon, or the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant, whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So here we have the messenger, the forerunner, who sent to prepare the way for Yahweh himself to come to his temple. And Jesus says, that guy is John the Baptist, and he's preparing the way for me. So how much clearer do you want it to be?
He never says he's preparing the way for me, not even one time. He never says preparing the way for God, right? For that I am God. He never says that. And in fact, when we look at dissimilarity, which I know you're a fan of,
I'm not.
I know, because critical historians and scholars use it. You're not a fan of it. When we can look at that and say, would they have added these things later? And that's obvious what was added in the book of John, because these are the things, when you look at Mark and Matthew especially, because Matthew's not even a source, it's a copy. It's very specific that Jesus is a man who is the Messiah. And the Messiah in Jewish, which we explained to you in the last debate that we had, myself and a Jew, said Messiah doesn't mean God. Right? And you understand that, right?
The title Messiah in itself means anointed one. The Hebrew word
doesn't mean God.
Well, it doesn't mean, the word doesn't mean God, but the Old Testament's predictions concerning the Messiah indicate that he is to be God.
So, the Messiah is to be God?
According to the Old Testament, yes.
Oh, you better tell the Jews.
Yeah, I do frequently.
You tell the Jews what they...
Fair enough, man.
No, you told the Jew, and he told you were fucking wrong.
And if you recall the debate, I totally refuted him on that.
No, you didn't.
Point and wasn't able to defend it.
No, you didn't. He told you that Messiah doesn't mean God. It means anointed one. They thought the Messiah was going to, as I explained
so let's
the Messiah wasn't. No, the Messiah was going to unshackle the chains of Rome, and he was going to become the king of the Jews. Not a God, the king of the Jews. And we even know this because in every piece of first century polemics in Palestine, what we see is that every single one of them thought that Jesus gained his divinity when he rose from the dead, and not a single second before that. That's what we get. And that's why they were even having the conversations by some of us follow Apollos, some of us follow Peter, some of us follow Paul.
No, that's not what that controversy was about. I'm sorry.
It's not? Oh, okay.
No. It was about rhetorical skills.
Can I cut in here real quick, because there's a conversation thread that I don't want to lose, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Nathan, you said that the times that Jesus refers to himself as God, he who has seen the Father has seen me. Can you give me those 3 quotes again, real quick?
Sure, I've got them written down because I think it's important to know what I'm talking about. It's in John 8:58. Truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. John 10:30, I and the Father are one. John 14:9, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. And John 17:24, Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am, and to see my glory, the glory you have given me because you loved me before the creation of the world.
Okay, so there's another interpretation there that would jump out to anybody that is familiar with Eastern philosophy, and also to anybody who's familiar with Hinduism, and that is that so. Especially, Buddhism grew out of Hinduism, and Hinduism holds essentially that everything, all that there is, you can almost consider it a kind of like pantheism, is Brahma. And the world that we experience is the Maya of Brahma, the magical power of Brahma, or I guess like the stage and set dressing. So, if you go with like Shakespeare said all the world's a stage and men and women are merely players. The Hindus and the Buddhists would go further to say that not only is all the world a stage and the men and women are merely players, but also the men and women are the set dressing and the rigging and the audience and the director. That literally the stuff, the actual physical stuff of the universe, of physical reality, is Brahma. That is the manifestation of the Godhead. So Jesus could very easily, and a number of people who have enlightening experience, satori's, that you see, you can find monks will have them after long periods of meditation and study. Sometimes people will have them after taking certain psychoreactive drugs, and sometimes they just happen for no reason whatsoever. They talk about instantaneous enlightenment where, you see the moon in a dewdrop and bang. The process of essentially ego death, where you stop identifying mentally just with yourself and your ego, and suddenly you're identifying with everything around you. Now, it's very easy that Jesus could have had one of these experiences. And when he's coming to speak to his disciples and to people and saying, look, you're it, and I'm it, and you have seen the Father, you've seen Brahma. If you've seen me, you've seen it, but also if you've seen literally anything else. It's kind of like how some people will say, I am the reincarnation of Siddhartha Gautama. Yeah, so is everybody else. Stop putting on airs, if that makes sense. So, I can see how he might have been telling the truth there, but also not claiming to be God in the kingly sense. Because let's face it, the early Christian church, it was very different, but as it grew and as it got absorbed by Rome, and especially Constantine, the figure of Christ was associated very strongly with the figure of Zeus and the figure of the king. And so we get sort of this relationship where our relationship to God, or the ultimate reality or whatever, is the relationship of a child to a grandfather, or a servant, or like a vassal to a lord. And I feel like that is a way that people can express ultimate reality, when they're living in that political system. But as we grow beyond it, we realize that what is being expressed is not literally that, if that makes sense.
It's I never heard that perspective of that before. No. Is it possible that both Christianity and Buddhism are true?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jonathan?
No.
I knew that was going to be the answer, so I just figured I'd ask.
Jonathan, did you want to add anything to that, to Brenton's last claim? If not, I have something new to introduce.
No, let's hear what you have to say.
All right, so maybe so just help me, because the topic is going to be, is Christianity true? Nathan and Brenton, I just want to know is if all these inconsistencies in the text that you guys see, or at least Nathaniel, would those make it so that Christianity is not true, or is there deeper issues that like if you sat up all night and you found that everything in the text is completely accurate, right? Then would you say it wouldn't follow from that Christianity is true? And then I guess that might help us get back toward, is Christianity true or not, rather than are the Gospels reliable?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can say with an incredible amount of confidence that the Gospels are not reliable. But the Gospels could be completely wrong, and more than they currently are, and even more irreconcilably contradictory. And Christianity could still be true. Jesus could have still, done some crazy stuff. I don't use the word magic, because magic is just an illusion. It's supernatural that we actually talk about. That stuff could be true, and people wrote legendary accounts about it, which is what I think the Gospels are. And then, of course, the Gospel of Peter, which was included for a very long time and was maybe after the infancy Gospel of James, the most popular gospel in the Middle Ages. All of that stuff. Oh yeah. I know you said a lot of things that aren't true, but you've been wrong about the rest of them. So I'm just
which canonical list has the Gospel of Peter?
The I'd have to look. I am sorry.
Well, it's not in any of them. The Muratorian fragments, the earliest that we have, which is second century, it's not present there. It's not present in the Athanasian canon. Which canon is it present in?
I don't have it in front of me, and I apologize, but I'm happy.
Because you're wrong. There is no canon.
You're like the most condescending prick. Are you aware of that?
Well, hang on. You've kind of gone after him pretty hard too.
Well, no, I've never been a prick to him.
No, you haven't. But you have been a little aggressive. You can.
Yeah, aggressive is one thing. All right, but
there's aggressive and there's passive. We got passive aggressive up here. We've got aggressive.
So why isn't okay?
Let's leave the ad hominem out of it and just get back to the.
Why isn't the Gospel of Peter true? Right, is a good question to ask, because it includes.
Sorry, go ahead.
It includes many of the same claims of the four canonical Gospels. Many of them,
but it's not. Sorry,
it is the stone rolling away, right? While Peter is there, the stone rolls away. It doesn't say angels, but the metaphor is obviously there. Go in, they carry Jesus out, right? He's walking. The cross, the metaphorical cross, comes out behind, and then Yahweh calls down from heaven. He calls down and says, "Hey, did you go talk to everybody that was dead and give them the gospel?" Which is where we get the idea that everybody can be saved, even if they have never heard the gospel. So that wasn't included. All of that could be wrong, which, by the way, I think that it is, and yet Christianity could still be true, because things could have happened that they didn't write down. We're talking about oral traditions here, where there are an incredible amount of inconsistencies from one person to the next. And to answer the question, if it would be compelling to me if we were to find accounts that were written concurrent to the life of Jesus that did not copy one another, like the three synoptics, that are not contradictory and that don't have a particular goal in mind. I think that would be very compelling to read it. Would that mean that it's true? No, but it'd be very compelling, and then to research that. And I think that that's the intellectual honesty that's necessary while we are researching this, because I think that many times we research these things and we have our own opinion on it, and whether it's apologetics or counter apologetics, we look for it that way. And I think the most important thing, if that evidence were presented, that if we had that we should say this is compelling, at least.
Yeah. Can I jump in on and answer the question? Because I'll have a very different answer here. I would say I would agree that everything could be not true and Christianity could still be true. Everything in the Gospels could be false. I will also say that 100% of everything in the Gospels could happen the way it happened, and Christianity could still be false. Again, like what we're looking at here is a fantastical account, and if the fantastical account happened, okay, we have evidence of a fantastical account. We don't have evidence of a God. We don't have evidence that Jesus was anything other than something that was really, really powerful and able to do things that we don't understand. So again, a lot of the times we have sort of relied on this because of this sort of Western Enlightenment tradition of trying to essentially squeeze religion into science and making it, making the two of them work together. And I can understand that impulse because of the type of culture we're in and because of where we're coming from. But the fact is these two things are operating on two completely different levels. Factuality, I don't really care too much about that. I care more about what Jesus taught and its effect on his followers, and does it actually lead to what he suggests that he leads to. Now, we might talk about salvation, for instance, salvation from death. And this is a pretty compelling thing. Somebody comes back from the dead. Okay. But imagine if we had the technology to literally do that. If there's a brilliant scientist that figures out a way to create a machine that brings people back from the dead or brings himself back from the dead, is that man suddenly God? I don't think he is. I think he's just a guy that figured out a way to bend or break the rules of nature. So we're left sort of at this impasse. And once again, then we're talking about religiosity. We're talking about essentially the truth of existence, of how we perceive it. And I think the most reasonable way to go about trying to establish what the truth is not trying to make it fit the narrative of a particular book, but to search for that truth through I guess almost a rigorous method. You could consider it like the scientific method, but you run into problems with that because of, I think there are some inherent incorrect assumptions baked into current materialism that science relies upon. And we could go into that if you wanted to. But my point is that I still don't find these miraculous occurrences particularly compelling, and I don't think that they're evidence for a God one way or the other.
Well, there's certainly evidence in the sense that they are more probable on the hypothesis of Christianity than on the annulment of that hypothesis.
Like you need somebody rising from the dead.
You could imply, they're impressive. I'll say that.
So it's not proof in a rigorous mathematical sense. I think when we're dealing with such questions, we want to look at the evidence and find out where does the balance of evidence lie. And the theological import of the resurrection of Jesus as being evidence for his messianic and divine credentials relates to the theohistorical backdrop or context of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's not some any old Joe Blow miscellaneous experiencing a miscellaneous resurrection in the middle of history, but rather it's Jesus of Nazareth who and there's various events in Jesus' life which point to him being the Messiah, various claims that he makes. We've got the Old Testament prophecies which talk about the Messiah, talk about the resurrection as well in Isaiah 53, for example. And so the resurrection, thus, is something which is highly probable on the hypothesis Jesus is the Messiah, but very highly improbable on the hypothesis that he's not, and that's why it's strong evidence for him being the Messiah.
Okay, so I can see how you would consider that strong evidence. I might say that you could put that in, like, if this is a court of law and if you could prove it, I might say that's evidence in that direction. I wouldn't call it conclusive in any way, shape, or form. But let me ask you something, because you're talking a lot about this prophecy or that prophecy, and I don't tend to find that that's how people think and function. So can I just ask you, like, why do you believe in Jesus? Like, I'm not saying that in like a kind of, I legitimately want to know, like, why do you believe in Jesus? What is it the most important thing that you find most compelling about this?
Do you mean, why do I believe Jesus as a historical person?
No. I mean, why do you believe? Why are you a Christian? Why do you follow this?
I'm a Christian because I'm persuaded by the public evidence that Christianity is true. And that's a cumulative argument from numerous points of data which point convergently, cumulatively, to the conclusion that Christianity is true. That includes the evidence for the resurrection.
Can you point to the most significant or one of the most significant reasons?
The evidence for the resurrection I find pretty compelling.
Okay, why?
Because we have because of there's a number of contending hypotheses which purport to explain the relevant evidence. One is that Jesus really rose from the dead, the resurrection hypothesis. One is the hallucination hypothesis, I'll call it the hallucination hypothesis, but I mean the broad category of the disciples were honestly mistaken, that they somehow came to believe Jesus rose from the dead, even though he didn't rise from the dead.
Can I hang on? I think I see where you're going with this, and I just want to rephrase the question really quickly. So what do you find so compelling about his resurrection?
Well, let me finish, because I'm getting there. Thirdly, there's the hypothesis that the disciples deliberately set out to deceive people that Jesus rose from the dead. We can build up the conspiracy hypothesis. And then finally, there's these hypotheses, or finally, there's the hypothesis that the disciples in fact didn't claim he rose from the dead, and actually that's a later mythical claim. So these hypotheses, I would contend, are mutually exhaustive hypotheses. And I think that the best explanation of the relevant data is that Jesus rose from the dead. For one thing, I think we can establish with high confidence that the disciples were at least sincere in their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. One of the evidences for that is the fact that they were willing to die as martyrs. The martyrdom of Peter and James, the Lord's brother, is particularly well attested. So then the question is, okay, so
what you're saying is that if I may, the belief of the disciples that led to them becoming martyred for Jesus, that's something you find compelling about the resurrection. Is that
yes? Yeah, so we have to explain the sincere belief of the disciples. What best explains them coming to that sincere belief? And when we look at the resurrection narratives in the Gospels, which I think are very firmly rooted in eyewitness testimony, then the resurrection claim is polymodal in character. It involves multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and so forth. And also, moreover, according to Acts 1, it was extended across 40 days. So it wasn't just one brief confusing episode. That's something that's very difficult to be wrong about. And so it points away from the honest mistaken hypothesis, and since there's good evidence against the conspiracy hypothesis, it points to the hypothesis that Jesus actually rose from the dead.
Okay, that's interesting and compelling. Thanks for sharing that with me. There is one thing that I want to point out, and that's that we found, scientifically, that eyewitness testimony tends to be unreliable. I'm not saying that. In fact, I do think that clearly, if they did honestly choose to die for this, and if that's being operated, that there clearly was a very strong reaction that they had with regard to Jesus. I don't know if that necessarily indicates resurrection, but I totally get that. I'm glad you found that compelling, so thank you for bringing that up.
So on that very quickly before you move on, so you're right that under certain conditions, eyewitness testimony is unreliable, especially on details, such as when there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun, or when the participants are strangers to one another, or when the events happen very quickly over a period of seconds or minutes. But by contrast, the resurrection claim, according to the four Gospels of Paul, is it involves multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but physical contact and so forth, eating breakfast with Jesus, group conversation, and it was extended across 40 days, so it wasn't a brief and confusing episode, and so it's. I think that
I get what you're saying there, though. I that could have easily been added by a writer later on. But
anyway, we have to look at the evidence to find out if that's true or not.
Yeah, but my point is, okay. So let me go over to Nathan here. So I guess my question is, because you used to be a Christian, correct?
Yup.
Yeah. So what is it that convinced you to stop? Like what was the point? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? And I'm sure you've got a lot of reasons. I've heard a lot of it here, but I'm interested kind of just in you personally, I guess, right here.
There's no evidence that anything supernatural exists or ever has existed.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Wait, can I just get some clarification there? Do you mean no evidence, or do you just mean insufficient evidence?
No compelling evidence. I appreciate you asking, getting a clarification on that. No compelling evidence.
Right. So what led you to eventually get to that point where you said that? Like, obviously, there was a moment I remember when I was, for the couple of years that I was an atheist, one of the things that got me to sort of lose my faith in Christianity was I had done a lot of thinking about the concept of doubt and eternal hell, and it sort of occurred to me, if I'm sitting there as a child's father, is relating to my child says, "I don't believe in you, Papa," I'm going to say, "Oh, really? Okay, is that my hand? Is that?" I'm not going to freak out and hit him and banish him or something. And when that hit me, I remember my brain sort of went click, and I was just like, "Oh, Oh my. And so I spent a number of years before I came to my faith as a Buddhist. So I guess I'm just wondering, like what was the moment? What was that like? What's the need that's driving you here, as opposed to, the intellect? I'm interested more in the emotional than the intellectual, if that makes sense.
It's important to me that I believe things that are true, and I find myself that the religions of the world, especially the three Abrahamic religions, are the most important things in people's lives. And in the United States of America, which is where I live, I think that people, overwhelmingly accept the Christian stories without knowing anything about them. McClatchy just referenced a bunch of stuff that I completely disagree with, and I don't know that he can show any historical attestation that anybody was martyred, as far as the disciples anyway, or even Saul. Yeah, sorry, bro.
Well, no, I'm happy to go into that if you want.
Well, why do you think we keep telling these stories about martyrs? We're seeing them, they're kind of cross-cultural. We see them all over the place. We all, as humans, find them really compelling.
So for the martyrdom of Peter,
go ahead. Where's the earliest one?
We have 2 first-century sources on the
first century. Are you sure?
First century, yes.
Oh, we have 2 of them. Are you sure? Because I'm reading it right now. Are you sure? Because even the 5 earliest apocryphal accounts of the apostles, the Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, Acts of Thomas, Acts of Andrew, and Acts of John were composed in the 2nd century under the influence of the Greek Romance novel. And that's actually things where we find the.
But we also have 2 first-century sources.
Do we? Who are they?
Yeah, 2 people who actually knew Peter personally.
Who are they?
So one of them is Clement of Rome.
Clement.
In section 5 of First Clement.
Didn't he say that Peter was killed on account of jealousy?
Yeah, he does.
Okay, so that doesn't seem like martyrdom to me.
It's usually interpreted as martyrdom.
Yeah, he wrote jealousy though.
Yeah,
that's not martyrdom.
It's not
martyrdom is when somebody puts you to a stake, or they burn you, or they drown you because they think you're a witch.
Okay,
that's martyrdom.
Perhaps a more explicit
like Christianity.
Perhaps a more explicit source then is John 21, because John was most scholars date John to around 90 to 95 CE, and John 21 mentions Jesus predicts ahead of time Peter's death, and it's very unlikely that John would have attributed that saying to Jesus as it actually happened in the manner that he said. And so that itself provides strong support for Peter's martyrdom.
Wait, so Jesus mentions that somebody's going to be martyred before they're martyred?
Yeah.
And that's evidence for you?
Yeah.
So, but it's not anything...
Because John's gospel was very probably written after Peter's martyrdom. That's widely accepted. Widely agreed.
Well, it's not even necessarily widely agreed that Peter was martyred.
Let me read the source. So this is what it says. It says, truly, so Jesus says, truly, I say to you, speaking to Peter, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This is said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God.
So you mean he's an old guy and he needs to be carried around because he's shitting himself?
Thanks for that image, but yeah, that seems like a point, a more universal point about the human condition, about how our bodies age and die, and once again, that was one of the first things that Siddhartha Gautama identified when he first stepped foot outside of his palace. He saw a sick man, an old man, and a dead man, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't realize there were these 3 things." And all of us kind of go through a similar process to that as we age and grow. Like my son is, he's nearly 2, and he doesn't know anything about death. He doesn't know anything about old age. He doesn't know about sickness, and he knows old age and that he's encountered it with his elderly relatives. But even then, it's not there. So I feel like a lot of the time these religions are tapping into universal things about the human condition, and essentially giving fantastical life to them, describing them in such a way where it is true to the emotions of the person who has encountered them, figuratively true, I suppose, as opposed to literally.
I agree with that.
All right, Brenton, before we go too far into the archetypal beliefs, let me just say this before we go forward, is that we've already been going over an hour. So at
Do we
this
want to take
point,
questions?
yeah, I want to try and jump into Q&A, but what I want to do is I want to give you guys a few minutes to just maybe 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll jump into Q&A. Since Jonathan's here by himself, we'll let him go last. Brenton, why don't we start with you, and just give us like maybe 2 minutes or something like that, 1 to 2 minutes, and just say what your final thoughts are, and then we'll jump into Q&A. Tag me with
Sure.
your questions at Converse Contender, and I'll ask them. Thanks.
I mean, one of the things that when I said I wanted to come in here and try to get my head wrapped around whether Christianity was true or not through this process here. One of the things that I have come to realize about religion as I have grown older is I've begun to very much embrace. I'm not a Marxist, but Marx's concept of man makes religion, religion does not make man. Oftentimes I find that people's spirituality is an outgrowth of who they are and what they need at a specific time. And that oftentimes I will see a projection. I don't think there's a single human being on the planet that follows their scripture 100%. I think they do, but ultimately we all pick and choose and sort of decide. So if you want me to answer the question of is Christianity true, I would really have to ask which Christianity, both which Christianity in the sense of the various denominations, but also which Christianity within each person's heart. I would also say that one of the things, and I've been a little more convinced of this, is I have been lately thinking of Jesus as a possible bodhisattva throughout people can look that up if they want to understand what that term is. And I think in a lot of ways, what he experienced sounds a lot like an enlightening experience, and it would make a lot of sense as a bodhisattva coming from a non-Buddhist culture. And if anybody does want to look into, I can find the exact quote in the Lotus Sutra, but there are specific things that Shakyamuni says directly related to that. The final thing that I want to end on here is in the Jainist faith, there's a story, I don't know if you guys have all heard about it, but it's 5 blind men in a room trying to describe an elephant. And one man finds the trunk and says, oh, it's a giant snake. And the other person finds the feet and says, oh, it's a huge beast. And another person finds the tail and says, no, it's a tiny, fly. I think in a lot of ways, the act of religiosity and the act of organized religion is a collective effort to discover the truth through many minds. And the thing about minds and individual consciousnesses is these things can only hold quite so much. So those are my thoughts. And then I had a final thing that I had a question that I wanted to ask for John. Was it? Jonathan. Yeah. So John, Nichiren Daishonin, the monk that originated my sect of Nichiren Buddhism, they attempted to kill him twice. And on the second time that the Japanese emperor attempted to have him assassinated because they didn't like what he was saying, he approached a Buddhist shrine and said to the deity at that shrine, they're about to kill me. I am the #1 promoter of the Lotus Sutra. You better do something. And as they sat him down to execute him, a comet streaked across the sky. And the would-be assassins and executioners got so frightened they tossed down their weapons and left, sure that what they were trying to kill was a Buddha. Now, you've previously used supernatural occurrences and the willingness to undergo martyrdom as a means to indicate divinity. So my question is that would you consider that proof of Nichiren Daishonin's divinity? And if not, why is that different?
So I'm not familiar enough with the history on that to comment intelligently. What I'll say, though, is that willingness to suffer and die as a martyr is strong evidence, I would argue, for sincerity. It doesn't necessarily indicate your beliefs are true, but it does suggest that you're sincere in your beliefs. And so that's all I use that for. On the supernatural occurrences thing, you would need to provide evidence for the veracity of those accounts.
Okay. So, but okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
Thanks so much for that, Brenton. We'll move over to Nathan for his, or Nathaniel for his. Just give us 1 to 2 minutes closing.
Sure. I'd like to say, first, Jonathan, I was a little heated earlier. I said you're a condescending prick. I don't think you're the condescending prick. Because I am, and you're not me. All right. I began this today by giving really 10 separate pieces of opposing evidence to Christianity, and I understand that we didn't get to all of them, mostly because we weren't just speaking about Christianity. I still, and I think that most critical scholars and historians would say that the Jewish Messiah, was not expected to be God or a deity at all, and so whenever Jesus was referred to as Messiah, it didn't mean anything. And I believe that can be shown to be the case, and I even was able to even show that in our last debate as well. We agree that the Gospels are the only things that talk about the life of Jesus, and that we agree that they're written anonymously by people who did not see the events happen decades after the events, and we don't have the original manuscripts, and they are copies of copies in an oral tradition in which things would have been changed. And we know that because we have different sources who say different things. We also know that the only place, and Jonathan even kind of alluded to this, it was even able to show this, the only place where Jesus explicitly says "I'm God" is in the Gospel of John, and that's very important, I think, because it moves contradictory to the Gospel of Mark, where he is specifically a man and an apocalyptic preacher. And the Gospel of John is the exact opposite of that. He's no longer an apocalypticist. And that we can even see that in the contradictory accounts of what happens with John the Baptist in the beginning of that book. And we have no evidence that the disciples were martyred. Literally no evidence. And in fact, we were able to show that because when Jonathan brought up Clement, it was actually about jealousy. And when he brought up the things about Peter, it's obviously shown that Peter was simply an old man. We have no evidence of all we have is what's known as church tradition. And church tradition is nothing more than somebody passing down stories. It does not mean the stories are true. At the beginning of our debate, Jonathan said that the Christians were persecuted by the Roman Empire until 313. That simply is not historically factual. There was a time for 3 or 4 years, and that's true by Ignatius, that they absolutely were. But by the Treaty of Milan in 313, it wasn't made legal because Christianity was actually already legal. It was simply made as the foundational religion of Rome, the Roman Empire. And as much as Jonathan's going to say, historical record shows that to be true. So when we look at this, Jonathan tried to lay out something with the Bayesian theorem, but never actually presented any historical evidence for any of the claims that he made. I'm appreciative of Brenton, and I think that the idea that when he said Buddhism and Christianity are compatible with one another if they the things that they are purported to bring forward, and the things that they say are positive, and that they lead somebody to a better source of enlightenment. And I would even go as far as to say, without hurting somebody else, please stop it.
Bad karma.
And yeah, but as far as I can tell, and again, we didn't get into a lot of stuff tonight, but as far as I can tell, there has been no additional compelling evidence that any of these things, the supernatural things that are purported to have claimed, ever happened. And I would even say that it's likely they didn't. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for that, Nathaniel. All right, we'll move on to Jonathan for his closing. Just give us 1 to 2 minutes of your closing thoughts.
All right, well, thank you. There's quite a lot that I would like to address, but I don't have time to. Let me just address a few of the key points that were raised there. He mentioned that in none of the Synoptic Gospels Jesus claimed to be God. I don't think we should dismiss John, because I think John's an extraordinarily reliable source, but I think that he's mistaken that the Synoptic Gospels do not present the deity of Christ, or don't attribute statements to that effect to Jesus. I gave one example already from Matthew 11. Let me give you another example. This is from Matthew 21, when Jesus is triumphantly entering Jerusalem. And it says that verse 15, when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you prepared praise. Now, where's he quoting from? He's quoting from the book of Psalms, chapter 8, where we read, and I quote, we read, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens, out of the mouth of babies and infants. You've established strength because of your foes, to kill the enemy and the avenger. But in Matthew 21, the praise is being directed to Jesus. And yet Jesus quotes this song from Psalm 8. And so I think there's another indication of Christ's deity from Jesus' words in the Synoptic Gospels. Nathaniel also mentioned that I didn't provide, there's no historical evidence for the claims that I made in my opening statement. Well, that's just simply false. Jesus' death at Passover, for example, is widely accepted by historians. In fact, it's attested in all four Gospels, and the Passion narratives in the four Gospels are independent of one another. As for Jesus enters into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, that's supported by an underlying coincidence. If you look at John chapter 12, it mentions that 6 days before Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany. He has dinner there with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. And in verse 12 says the next day, that would be 5 days before Passover, a large crowd that was coming. He's heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem and so forth. Now, if we go over to Mark chapter 11, we can actually count each of these days, these 6 days, even though Mark does not give us that same timestamp. So if we go to Mark chapter 11, Mark actually telescopes the narrative. Verse 1, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethany, and all Jesus said to his disciples and said to them, go into the building in front of you, and immediately she went to go find a colt tied which no one had ever sat, untie it and bring it. So if we assume for the sake of argument that John is correct, Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover. When we get to verse 11, it says he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple. When he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany at 12. If John is correct, that would make it the evening of 5 days before Passover. Verse 12, on the following day when the king from Bethany was hungry, that would be the morning of 4 days before Passover. Verse 19, when evening came to enter the city, that would make it the evening of 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, the fig tree withered away to its roots, that would be the morning 3 days before Passover. Chapter 13 is the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. So we can assume, I think, fairly, that this is the evening of 3 days before Passover. Chapter 14, verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover. It synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the veracity of the chronology according to John chapter 12. And so I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks so much for that, Jonathan. Now, before we jump into Q&A, I want to exercise moderator privilege and ask a couple questions myself, just very quickly, like maybe a lightning round, then we'll go to the questions. So for Brenton, I was just wondering, and this might help out some people in the audience as well. So I can recall listening to Ravi Zacharias talk. He says that he spoke with the first female Buddhist monk, I believe it is, that and he asked, aren't you, should you cut off your desires? Is that one of your principles? And she said, yes, that is one of the principles, that we should try and cut off our desires. And he asked, but don't you desire to see your children? And he said her response was, that's the hardest part between my life and my religion. So my question is your branch of Buddhism in that same way? Is that one of your same principle? Do you struggle with that, or do you have like another understanding?
No, I have a completely different understanding. It sounds like you have to be very careful with monks. They sometimes take things too far. They can be very authoritarian. And she may have also been a Theravada Buddhist. There's two different sects. Think of them like, I guess, kind of like Jews and Christians almost, or maybe Catholics and Protestants. So she's definitely not from my sect, which is heavily focused on like Buddhism for everyday life, for everyday people. We love our children. So when he talks about cutting off desires, this is actually Buddhism, again, is a religious practice, and it is very important. You have to do it. And so when someone who's new who comes into a monastery or to Buddhist teachings, the first thing they'll do is they come up to their teacher, and the teacher says, okay, I've got all those problems, my mind's disordered. And the teacher says, okay, well, you suffer because you desire, so try to stop desiring. And the student goes, okay, and goes off and try to stop desiring. Wait a minute. I'm desiring to stop desiring. What the hell? And then he goes back to the teacher and he says, I tried to stop desiring, but I realized that I desire to stop desiring. So what do I do? And the teacher goes, okay, you're good for finding that. Try not to desire, but not too much. Just try to stop desiring as much as can reasonably be expected. And this is like the first step on a very, very long path. Again, the practice of Buddhism is to bring about a conscious awakening within the person. And as a result, both the Buddha himself and especially Buddhist teachers and gurus, they will troll the crap out of you.
Nice. So,
yeah, but it's for your own good.
Well, thanks so much for that. Nathaniel, my question for you is, and I think you kind of hinted to this earlier on, and I hear this from a lot of people, is John and Matthew both, scholars say that they seem embellished, or at least they seem to have more of a supernatural-ish worldview than Mark and Luke. But my question for you is, well, couldn't that just be because Mark and Luke are Gentiles and Matthew and John are Jews? So obviously they're going to have a more Jewish understanding of some of these things.
As far as we can tell, the Gospels were written by Greek-speaking Christians. We don't know if they're Gentiles or not. They would have been, it's possible they could have been Jews living in Rome. But
with Mark and Luke, we do know, right?
No, we don't actually know. We don't know who wrote Mark and Luke. Okay. We have no idea. They're anonymous. In fact, Luke, even the author of the book of Luke, even says himself that I got this from somebody else who got it from somebody else, and I don't even know my own name apparently.
I can confirm that also, and that's one of the few things I remember from my religious teachings, that the four authors are unknown.
Yeah, I understand that. They're attributed by early church fathers, right? But yeah, I appreciate that. And so you don't think that that would be one of the reasonings then?
No, I think what we're talking about are again writings that happened 40 to 65 years after the supposed events, and you have legendary embellishment that happens in there. And now, mind you, when we talk about in the book of Matthew, the dead rising and walking around Jerusalem, I would even attest that's likely metaphorical in talking about, and with something that alludes something that Peter in the Gospel of Peter alludes to. But these are other pieces. Luke is supernatural in its own way, speaking about the birth of Jesus in its own right is incredibly supernatural, and it simply is which supernatural claim can we actually look at to see if we can provide independent attestation of it, regardless of now the book of John is its own. It's my favorite that it made it in the Bible, but it's its own own level of legendary. And so when we look at the Gospel of Luke, I like to hear that people, they were writing to the Jews, they were writing to the Gentiles. I don't think that's true. I think that they were, because again, Matthew is 95% of Mark, right? And all the writer of Matthew did was correct some geographical type errors and then add on to stuff that later made it into the book of Mark, and specifically the resurrection narrative. So I don't.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the super chats and the questions from the audience real quick. Jonathan, if there's anything in there that you feel compelled to answer, want to do that or make a comment on, go ahead real quickly.
In terms of geographical blunders in Mark, what examples do you have in mind?
He puts a town on the wrong side of the lake.
Can you show me?
I can find it. Yeah, hold on a second.
Yeah. While they're doing that, by the way, there was a quick thing I wanted to read at some point. I don't know if we have time to do it. It's a quote from the Lotus Sutra that I mentioned earlier. If we don't have time, it's cool. They can post it or something later.
Well, we do have quite a bit of
Let's go through the questions.
I can't stay for super much longer. So
Okay, so let's go ahead. Yeah, so let's just try and go ahead and get through some of these. Brian Stevens asked, it's a Patreon comment. Thank you so much, Brian Stevens, for being one of our patrons. You can see at the bottom of the screen, I and the other people that are patrons. Thanks so much for this comment. Brian says, Richard Carrier uses Bayes' theorem to show Jesus didn't exist. People abuse valid mathematics all the time to push the views they want. What do you have to say about that, John?
Yeah, and people have also used deductive syllogisms to arrive at false conclusions. So garbage in, garbage out. The Bayes' theorem is only a mathematical tool for modeling our arguments. It is very much contingent, dependent upon what values you plug into the equations.
All right, thanks so much for that. We'll try and go quickly through these so that we can get the majority of them in before Jonathan goes. Let's see. Next is we got a super chat, $2 super chat from the former lead singer of Nickelback, Steven Steen. Thanks so much for your super chat. Says Gavin won tonight. He didn't even need to come. Thanks so much for that. Next, we have a question from Crazy Monk 27. Can you ask him why is the proof of God? Sorry. Can you ask him why the is proof of God and not proof of good editing, since the New Testament was all word of mouth for over 100 years at the least until it was written?
Well, that's not true. All the Gospels are in the first century, so it's and Jesus died around 30 AD. I would personally say that there's a lot of debate about the exact dating of the Gospel authorship. I would personally date the Gospel of Mark to the 50s AD, and I would probably date John pre-70, although that's a minority view. I would probably date Luke pre-60. And I think that the Gospels are very close up to the facts, and that they're written by people who either were apostles themselves or were closely acquainted with apostles.
All right, thanks so much for that. For Nathan, Steven Steen, another $2 super chat. Thanks so much, Steven Steen, for your $2 super chat. Nathan, you knew he was going to bring up the Huskers, same as last time. It says, Bo Pelini is the best Huskers coach of all time. Which I'm sure you have to disagree with that, right?
You know what? I feel like there is empirical evidence that that's likely true. At least for anybody that's been alive since 2000.
Sure. All right, Twitch Loken 16. Thanks so much for your your $10 super chat with no question, just supporting the channel. Thanks so much to Twitch Loken 16. See Twitch Loken everywhere. So thanks for that. The Yato God says, Converse, for Brenton, what are your views on Hinduism as a Buddhist? I know that you did bring up earlier, Brenton, the Vedas and Upanishads. So what do you got to say about that?
I mean, there's a lot to like in Hinduism, and there's a lot that I disagree with and understand why Buddhism grew out of it. A lot of Hinduism is justifying the Hindu caste system, which is monstrous. And it clearly doesn't make sense even from the Hindu worldview. And also, I consider it to be a slander of the Lotus Sutra, which is about like one of the worst things you can possibly do in my sect of Buddhism. So what I would say is I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found in the Vedas, and there's a lot of important context. But in the way that religion has become politicized, it's very interesting, but also you really got to be careful with it, if that makes sense.
All right. Thanks so much for that. That does make sense. So next we have a $2 super chat from none other than Divine Disbelief. It says, the Atheist won. Best story came from Buddhist.
That's what I'm good at doing. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that.
I feel like that's a good opinion to take. I appreciate it.
Awesome. So we have another $2 super chat from Steven Steen. That makes 3 total. Scott Frost loves Jesus.
That's a true statement.
Who
Like
can
that's,
argue with that?
yeah, he's absolutely a Christian. So there you go. And that means Christianity is true, by the way, because Scott Frost apparently is like a god in Nebraska. So there you go.
Sure. Thanks so much for that. Looks like that's just a troll comment toward Brenton. I'm not going to read that one out.
Thank you.
Brian Stevens says, question, is it possible that the writers of a gospel had access to or read the other gospels when they wrote their gospels? If so, could this have aided in designing a coincidence? I think he's talking about your the criterion that you used earlier of not dissimilarity, but what was
Undesigning coincidences, right?
Yeah, undesigning coincidence. Sure.
So he's absolutely right. I mean, it's not just possible, but it demonstrated that the at least the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, utilize one another. The mainstream view is that Mark was written first, and Matthew was written second, and used Mark, and then Luke was written subsequent to that, and then drew upon Mark and possibly Matthew, depending on which view you take. But I don't think that undermines at all the argument from undesigning coincidences, because when we look at undesigning coincidences, what we see is relevant independence, namely that the gospel authors have their own independent access to the relevant events and details concerning those events. For example, in John chapter 6 and verse 5, you have the setup of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. Verse 5 says, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, where would you buy verses people to eat? Which immediately raises the question in the mind of the audience, why does Jesus turn to Philip here on this occasion? Go to John 12, and we learn that Philip showed a certain town called Bethsaida, mentioned incidentally in a completely different context. Luke chapter 9 has the parallel of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. It doesn't mention Philip in that context at all, but it does mention that the event took place at Bethsaida. So the pieces fit together in a way you would expect on the hypothesis of historicism. And that doesn't seem to me to be at all undercut by John utilizing Luke, if that is the case, because you would expect him to then mention the reason why Jesus turns to Philip, John 6:5, namely that Philip's strong with Bethsaida, but that's not mentioned there in that context. He doesn't even mention that Bethsaida is the setting of the miracle story. You have to do the detective work, and so it's the casualness of the allusions and their subtle interconnectedness, which I think is the mark of truth in these cases.
All right, thanks so much for that. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick? It's just a quick question. All right, Jesus fed the 5,000 a couple different times. How come none of the 5,000 talked about it ever? Jonathan,
well,
just real quick.
Well, that's an argument from silence, number one. And secondly, what reason do you have to think that any of them wrote anything that would have survived?
Oh. All right, thanks so much for that. We have a question from Philip.
Not a response.
Servanjak. Thanks so much for your $5 super chat. Question for Jonathan. If you do not believe in the tenets, if you do not believe in the tenets of Christianity, but still follow the moral teachings of Jesus, will you still be saved?
No.
Thanks so much for that answer. That's a... Oh, nope, that's just a trollish statement towards Nathaniel. We'll skip that one.
No, come on. I like... Come on. Yeah, what do you got? What do you got? Yeah, oh yeah.
Gasper says, Nathaniel, if you can't own a Christian without getting butthurt, that's a you problem. Okay, I think he's saying if you can't get owned by a Christian without getting butthurt, that's a you problem.
Hey, look. The only owning that happens here is in the books of Exodus and Leviticus.
All right, so it's $5 super chat from Philip Servanjak. Thanks so much. I hope I'm not butchering that name. There's some little things above the letters there, so I'm sure there's probably some pronunciation there that I'm missing. But question for Jonathan. Can you give an estimate for the probability that Christianity is true? If it is less than 100%, why can't God 100% prove himself? Yeah, answer that.
I don't so much like to put an exact value on it because I don't think humans are like that. I don't think that we're supercomputers that are just crunching numbers. I think we can try to model our arguments using Bayes' theorem and to come up with kind of a level of confidence that we are justified in proportion to the amount of available evidence. I would say that I'm highly confident to the point of being confident beyond reasonable doubt that Christianity is true. I wouldn't say that I'm confident beyond all doubt, and I wouldn't say that I'm certain that Christianity is true, but I'd say that I'm certain to the same level that would be necessary to establish in a court of law.
All right, thanks so much for that. Now we got a serious question. It's a super chat from Steven Steen, $2. Says, Nathaniel is a former flat earther. Interesting.
I'm wearing a NASA shirt. I don't know how that. It also says I need
fake news.
Faith. So I don't know if that's true. Now Scott Frost is still a Christian though, so we'll go with the other ones.
All right. So Tioga, please correct me if I'm saying that wrong, says, Brenton, should people with psychosis or delusion indulge in metaphysical beliefs?
Yes. Okay. So first off, psychosis and delusions. A lot of this is like different people's brains being pathologized by society. Because really oftentimes, if you look back in the history of mankind, people with quote unquote mental illnesses, people suffering from schizophrenia or a number of other conditions, they were held up as like holy people. They had insights that the rest of us did not have because their brains work differently. And we can even see it today in our culture because people who oftentimes have dyslexia wind up being some of the most successful entrepreneurs because their brains work differently. So I think that metaphysical ideas, you should be careful with your thoughts. You should be mindful of your thoughts, just like any other mind-altering substance. But I really think that the idea that a person with mental illnesses cannot be spiritual is like, these were some of the most spiritual people in the entire world. For centuries. It's really more the society that grew up around us that says, okay, you've got to be up at this time, at work at this time, you've got to do this, you've got to deal with this. It's so highly regimented that things that maybe would not cause as many problems as they do cause many more today because, the savage world we are forced to all live in.
All right. Thanks so much for that. Jonathan, I know we're running low on time, so we'll get to the last few here. Scott Lott, thank you so much for your $5 super chats. Ask, Jonathan, if we discovered a religion with more empirical evidence than Christianity, would you believe that one instead?
You would need to show me why I am not justified in believing Christianity. I mean, the evidence for that would need to be overturned or explained in a better way. But if the evidence supported another religion instead of Christianity, then yes, I would be a follower of that religion instead. Absolutely. I apportion my beliefs in accordance with the evidence, and I follow the evidence wherever it leads.
I have a question with that.
Yeah.
Because people ask me if there was evidence that a God exists, would I say that a God exists? And the answer to that is yes. That does not mean that I would follow or worship that God, though. So I don't think the question necessarily was would you follow the religion, but rather say that it's true.
Well, it depends on the particulars, right? So I would say it's true, absolutely.
Okay, I was just wondering because you said you'd worship one. I'm like, all right, just wondering, like if it ends up being like.
Okay, you make a fair point.
I had a quick question for Jonathan, by the way, based on an earlier question when you said that somebody that follows the teachings of Christ but does not believe in the divinity of Jesus, would they be saved? You said no. I want to ask you something really quickly because so. You've got a loving and just God, but also he punishes people infinitely for finite crimes. How can you square that circle?
I don't claim to know. I don't. So there's different models. For instance, some people have suggested that people continue to sin in hell, and that's why the punishment is eternal. Other people have suggested that hell is not in fact eternal. The conditionalists, most famously John Stott. So there's a number of different perspectives on that. I tend to be agnostic on that question.
Okay,
All right,
fair
thanks
enough.
so much for that.
Good answer.
We've got a $2 super chat from Rapture Countdown. Says, atheists that live in a universe, I want evidence. I think they were supposed to say atheists. I think they were supposed to say atheists live in universe, I want evidence.
The evidence that atheists live in this universe?
No. I think they're saying that, man, you guys always just, your main claim is just, I want evidence all the time. So you live in a universe, I want evidence. I think that's what he's trying to say, but I could be wrong. So we'll just move on to Citrus Favorite Sarabia. Thanks so much for your $2 super chat. Great and generous guest as usual. It says, to guests, what would prove each one false? Not sure about that one either, Sigifredo. Sorry.
Are they asking like what would are they asking each of us what would prove like Christianity false if we had it? Is that the question, or?
It says the number 2 and then guest, as in you're my guest. What would prove each one false? I'm not sure about that, so maybe we'll skip that and you can try and clarify while we ask these last couple questions. Iron Charioteer says, ask Jonathan, how long did Jesus spend in the tomb? Does it depend which gospel you read, or did Jesus do as Jonah did, like he claimed?
No, it doesn't depend which gospel you read, because all 4 gospels are consistent that Jesus rose again on the Sunday following his death. So he spent between the Friday and the Sunday in the tomb.
All right.
Well, John doesn't agree with you.
Show me.
The book of John, he is crucified before the Feast of the Unleavened Bread.
No, I disagree with that, but that's one.
It says it very specifically.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
No, it doesn't.
It says before the Feast of the Unleavened Bread.
So since that is kind of a long-winded thing to get into, we have such short time.
Yeah.
I have heard information on this, and it does kind of take a minute to draw out. So maybe we'll skip over that, and then maybe one day we'll have Nathaniel and Jonathan one-on-one. But so let's skip on. We have Buck Melanoma says the Gospels taste like Shani's squirt thoughts. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but
I'm not
You
gonna.
have the most articulate question askers here.
yeah.
I'm not going to deal with that.
All right. Buck Melanoma once again has another $2 super chat. Thank you so much, Buck Melanoma, for your super chat. See you a lot as well in comments. Says squirts. Thoughts? All right, so we'll move on because I don't think you guys have any thoughts about that. But Susan says, tell Nathaniel, Susan Turpin, thank you so much for your $2 super chat, says, tell Nathaniel I'm going to rub his shiny bald head.
I've been looking at that all night.
Nice.
Which one?
What was that?
Nothing.
Oh,
Nope.
gotcha.
Anything? This is a PG channel.
Sure. All right, Super Horror Energy. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your $5 super chat. Sarah asks, contemporary historians are silent because the events never happened. Even Alexander the Great had contemporary attestation. Jonathan, what about that zinger?
Well, we have contemporary attestation of Jesus in the sense that we have attestation for people who lived contemporaneously with Jesus, even though they wrote after his death. And by the way, with Alexander the Great, the earliest extant biographies of him are Aaron and Plutarch, who wrote some 300 years after Alexander's death. But the Gospels are written by people who were either eyewitnesses or people who were closely associated with eyewitnesses. And who have a track record of being extremely reliable. So
You can't show any of that to be true.
well, I've written and spoken extensively on it. So
Yeah, it doesn't mean you're
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
All right, looks like
No.
our last question here for the night, and we can get on with our lives here. Jeez, modern day debate.
Go to bed.
Yeah. Stupid Whore Energy, thank you so much for your other $5 super chat. She calls herself that. Sarah asked, McClatchy, did you abandon your argument with regard to the Gulo gene?
The gilozidogene? Which argument is he talking about? So the gilozidogene is an argument for human-chimp shared ancestry, which I accept. So, yeah. So I'm a proponent of intelligent design, but I accept common ancestry.
All right, thanks so much for that. And I want to end by thanking each of our guests tonight. Jonathan McClatchy, go check out the YouTube channel. Check out some of his work. You just accomplished your PhD in biology. Is that correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
All right, awesome, man. Congratulations on that. I certainly want to give you props on that because I envy you. I also want to thank Nathaniel. Nathaniel, you can obviously tell is very well read, and I want to appreciate you for being here as well in representing the atheist position. Brenton as well in the Buddhist position. As last time when we had you on, I think a lot of people wanted to see you back, so it's definitely a good thing to have you back on here and for representing the Buddhist position. Thanks everybody else who was in the comment section. Yeah, we had like 300 something people watching. We have like 50 likes. So how about hitting the like button? That way it lets James know we want to see this again. So
yeah, and how about some of you guys, if you can, run over to the Snow White Zombie Kickstarter. Yeah. We are $50 away from breaking $7,500. I really want to see that happen. So if you can do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we'll take the Kickstarter. I'll get James to throw that into the description. That way you can support Brendan's work there, and also Nathan. Both of all their information will be in the description, if not tonight, by tomorrow. So thanks for everybody that's in the chat. Thanks for all the super chats. Thanks for all of the patrons like Brian Stevens and Nathan Thompson and others. And thanks again for being here. And as usual, keep sifting the reasonable from the unreasonable.